Join C-SPAN as our America in the Court series takes a special look at the 1988 term. You'll get a live tour of the Library of the Supreme Court. You'll also get a chance to question a journalist who can explain the important decisions left on this term's docket. Live, Monday, May 16th at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, 3:30 p.m. Pacific Time. There's no better way to plan your C-SPAN viewing than with the C-SPAN Update. The Update is C-SPAN's weekly newspaper, which highlights events that air on the network. Call 1-800-321-5100 and we'll send you 50 issues of the Update for just $24. When you order, we'll also send you a free gift, our Road to the White House poster, a pen and ink drawing that depicts C-SPAN's grassroots approach to the campaign. Call 1-800-321-5100.
Up next on C-SPAN, we re-air a viewer call-in program with House Majority Leader Thomas Foley of Washington. We will leave this program in order to bring you live coverage of the conference of the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee as soon as that event gets underway.
Representative Tom Foley, Democrat from Washington, the majority leader of the U.S. House of Representatives. Trade legislation is finally passed Congress, signed by the Speaker on the House side, soon to head over to the President. What do you think the response will be when it reaches the President's desk?
Well, I'll tell you what I hope it will be. I hope the President will reconsider his threat to veto the bill and sign it. This is a bill that's been 3 years in the drafting and passage. It's been the product of 23 different committees of the Congress, House and Senate, and it's, for the most part, a bill which is not controversial. There has been an enormous sense of support in the House and the Senate for the great bulk of this bill. Probably 90% of it has been passed without serious objection. Some of the things that were objected to in the bill, the so-called Gephardt Amendment, the Bryant Amendment, were removed from the bill, much to the objection of the sponsors and many of their supporters. So the bill has been compromised to meet some of the objections that the administration has offered. There remain two issues, really one principal issue, that the President objects to, which is the provision that requires 60 days notice before a plant can be closed if it involves more than 100 workers. Now that particular provision, and one that deals with Alaska oil, which is, I think, one that there isn't any great particular disagreement about. We tried to change it before it went to the President. The administration, oddly enough, objected to changing it, even to meet their own objections. But the provisions on plant closing are supported by over 80% of the American people, if the polls are to be believed. It's a moderate bill, so described by the Wall Street Journal. It provides for exceptions where special circumstances arise or unforeseen circumstances arise in a company. But just providing 60 days notice to workers and to the community when the company knows the plant is going to be closed has all kinds of benefits, among them monetary benefits. It's estimated that it would save, in terms of rehiring or getting a new job, something like 3.5 to 4 weeks' time for many workers, saving them $1.5 billion a year and saving unemployment compensation maybe $400 or $500 million.
a bill like this passes, the president has said he objects, as you said, to that 60-day notice plans. He said very clearly he would veto it. Some of those parts of that are now out of it, but the 60-day notice is still in it. As it goes from Congress over to the president, will there be any more lobbying? Is there any more room for negotiations, you think, with the president? Will there be any contact or communication between Congress and the president between now and the time it gets to his desk?
Well, we're urging him publicly and every way we can to reconsider this threat to veto it. The president can make any decision he wishes on it. He has the power to veto this bill. We have the opportunity, if he does so, and I think the probability of overriding the veto. But we hope the president reconsiders, because it seems to us strange that a provision that the administration itself says is desirable, that almost all the public that has been asked thinks is desirable, and it should be objected to because it's a government requirement. There are exceptions to the requirement. There are provisions that only apply if the plant is going to involve more than 100 workers in this. It's really a moderate, reasonable provision. And for the president to bring down a trade bill that has very important features that the administration supports, and apparently a bill that he would otherwise sign because of a simple fairness requirement for plants to notify workers when they know the plant's going to be closed, is very difficult for us to understand.
Some critics of the bill are saying that specifically Democrats who've worked on this have made this on purpose a political campaign year issue. They knew he would veto it with this one measure in it, so they sent him a trade bill that he'll veto, and then they'll go throughout during the election year saying, look, the president is anti-labor, the president's out to do this. Have you made this more of a political election year issue than it needs to be?
No, we'd like the president to sign the bill and prevent it from being an issue. I think inevitably it'll be an issue if the president vetoes the bill, not because we want it to be, but simply because it's out there as a difference between us on this issue. Many Republicans have supported the passage of the trade bill through Congress with this provision in it. The conference report was passed by an overwhelming number of the House, including, as I say, many Republicans. It's seen by Americans as fair, it's responsible, it's moderate. It's far less rigorous, for example, than provisions that exist in many other countries by court or administrative or statutory provision. Great Britain has a provision. France has a provision, Germany has a provision, Canada, Japan. The countries in which we deal with whom we're competitive have provisions of this kind. And the President's own commission, headed by Secretary of Labor Brock, made a statement that they thought that provisions of this kind were important and valuable when they examined the Canadian version.
Good evening and welcome to our program. For the next 45 minutes, we're discussing the issue of trade, specifically the trade bill that's been passed by Congress on its way over to the president's desk. Widely reported, clearly you've read or heard a good deal about trade and this bill specifically. And our guest joining us this evening to discuss this is Representative Tom Foley. He's a Democrat from Washington, the majority leader of the U.S. House of Representatives. He represents the 5th Congressional District in the House, and that includes Spokane, Washington. First elected to the House in '64, elected majority leader this year. Formerly was the House Majority Whip from '81 to '86. He has his BA and law degree from the University of Washington and is originally from Spokane, Washington. Phone lines are open for viewers in all areas of the country. If you'd like to join in our discussion of trade, have a question or comment for the majority leader. If you live in an Eastern or Central time zone, it's 202-628-2525. Those of you in Pacific and Mountain time zones, it's 202-783-2727. If, as predicted, he vetoes this bill, do you think you'll have the votes in both the House and the Senate to override it?
I think so. I can't speak as clearly for the Senate. I'm sure we would have them in the House. It passed by a virtual 3-to-1 margin. It takes 2-to-1 to override.
Does it give the president, obviously, if he knows that you don't have the votes, let's say just in the Senate to override it, is it a greater emphasis on him to go ahead and veto such a bill?
Well, I hope not, because I think the president will make a mistake, not just a political mistake. I'm not so concerned about that. I think he will make a mistake in terms of the policy of this country if he vetoes this bill, particularly on this plant closing issue. What the president is saying, if he vetoes it on plant closing, is that the rest of the bill is all right. Now, the administration had many concerns about the original version of the bill. All sorts of compromises and changes and accommodations were made to satisfy those objections. Now the president's down to really literally one issue. You exempt a certain issue on Alaska oil, which is really not so relevant to our discussion. The basic question, he says, is plant closing. Otherwise, the bill is apparently acceptable to him. Plant closing, we believe, is a valid, fair, and valuable part of this bill. And it's there because members of Congress in great majority thought it should be there. And if we've made accommodations to satisfy the President's objections, why can't the President make a compromise as well? Much of what is in this bill is not only not opposed by the administration, it's enthusiastically supported by it, including the authority of the President to continue negotiations under the GATT round, other features of the bill.
Our guest, the Majority Leader of the U.S. House of Representatives, first call, Bow, New Hampshire. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Yes, I wanted to just make a brief comment for the end of the last segment and then get to the trade protectionist bill, and that is that all the callers were talking about Jesse Jackson and how white people are not willing to vote for a black candidate. And nothing was ever brought out of the fact that it's not black candidate that counts here, it's Jesse Jackson.
All right, your comment on trade then.
It up that, he stands with Che Guevara, et cetera, down the line.
All right, and your comment on trade, please.
Why? Black, white.
New Hampshire, we're going to try to confine our discussion to trade for this program, so if you have a specific comment or question on that, go ahead, otherwise I'm going to have to let you go.
Okay, the trade protectionist bill. I'm a pretty intelligent guy, but I don't understand the way it's been talked about on the national news, et cetera, and in the newspapers. It's kind of a boring subject, and I know it's a very important subject, but most people, I think, including myself, are very confused about what the trade protectionist bill on President Reagan's side means, as well as the representatives that you have on the show today.
Okay, thanks for the call.
Well, in the first place, it's not a trade protectionist bill. I come from part of the country, the Northwest, that has a great stake in foreign trade. And the last thing we would want to see is a protectionist bill that would stifle or limit foreign trade. What this bill does is expand the opportunity for the United States to be more competitive in international trade. It does have some provisions that tend to make a more level playing field, as they say, to encourage reciprocity with our trading partners. There's no real reason why our market should be open to foreign goods, as they should be, and their markets not be open to American goods. I think Americans across the board think that that's only fair. We have 2 or 3 choices here. We can do nothing and let discriminatory and protectionist legislation against American goods exist in foreign markets while our markets are open, or we can truly bring in protectionist provisions that stop foreign goods from coming in here. That would be wrong. I and the vast majority of members of Congress would oppose that. Or we can ask for simple fairness and reciprocity and openness of those markets with our own. But the bill goes far beyond that. It provides for educational assistance, it provides for trade adjustment, it provides for special research facilities, it undertakes to make provisions available to the government and to industry to expand our exports, things that are not only not objected to by the administration, but are strongly supported by the administration, including the authority to proceed on a so-called fast track at the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, the GATT negotiations, and the Uruguay round, which the administration urgently has requested.
Kissimmee, Florida. Good evening. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I was hoping that you all would have a Dick Gephardt or someone like that on so I could lash out at him, but since you got a nice guy like Tom Foley on, I can't in good conscience lash out at him, because even though I oppose him, he's a nice guy, and that's what a lot of Reagan's opponents say. He's a nice guy, so I can't really in good conscience lash out at him. But this trade bill, I wanted to speak about the coincidence, and I don't think it's a coincidence, that they waited, as Tom Foley said, 3 years till an election year, so that he could veto something that is, like he said, very popular. I think also minimum wage will come up this year, and again, it won't be any coincidence. It'll be because they can use it as a political issue, and I think it is a very politically smart move by the Democrats who control the Congress for now. I think you also see something on maybe acid rain, the environment, something that also touches a nerve with most moderate Americans. And my goodness, Mr. Foley, Dukakis might win after all. Even Jesse Jackson. Of course, if Jesse Jackson wins, you'll be the minority leader of the House of Representatives, not the majority leader. But anyway, nice talking to you. And
Florida, thanks for the call,
Let me just
Congressman.
comment. First of all, thank you for the nice comments. But very frankly, it hasn't been designed to come late and be an election issue. In the previous Congress, we passed a trade bill, but it didn't proceed through the Senate. So it wasn't presented to the President, couldn't be an election issue. It wasn't passed by the Senate. Although the issue was important, we didn't try to make it a big razzle-dazzle political issue. We would prefer, infinitely prefer, for the President to sign this bill, and after all, he has stated no real objections to what he calls the trade provisions of the bill. Most of the bill, he's objected to this one issue on plant closing. Much rather have him sign it and to have this issue resolved in a way that would remove it from any politics. I come from a part of the country, again, the Northwest, where trade's very important. We think this legislation is positive now, and I supported Dick Gephardt for the presidential nomination, as I think many viewers know. I didn't support the Gephardt amendment, and Dick Gephardt felt very strongly, voted against this bill because it was taken out. So it's a changed bill from the terms that were originally in here, and many people think it's too weak. The administration has been accommodated time and time again, sometimes with great objection from many members of Congress, in making the bill more to their liking. And now we have the President saying he's going to veto on one issue, basically, which is the issue of plant closing, which he also says is not a trade issue. So the trade portions of this bill, the overwhelming portion of this bill, seem to be acceptable to the President if we could eliminate one issue. But this is an issue that many people think is also a fairness issue.
Twin Falls, Idaho. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Congressman Foley.
Yes, sir.
Why don't you separate these? Separate the plant closing from the big main trade bill, get that policy established, and then go after the plant closing part of it. This puts it strictly political to me, and it seems to me you can separate it.
Well,
Your comments.
we could technically separate it. It came up for a vote in the House of Representatives, and a very strong majority decided they wanted to see this provision retained. There are other provisions in this bill that probably could be eliminated. The windfall profits tax repeal is strongly supported by the administration. It could have been taken out of the bill. It's there. There are provisions that change various other parts of law. They don't all have to be in a trade bill. Some of them are controversial. But the fact of the matter is, after many, many months of many committees working hard, this is the best package, the best compromise that we think we can present to the President, and it's one that overwhelmingly accommodates in numbers of changes his objections and his administration's objections. Now he says, what about one more objection? Well, the feeling was that this was, for the President, was asking too much because the provision is a moderate one. It's so declared by the Wall Street Journal editorially. It's overwhelmingly supported in polls by Americans. It will save money. It is not going to present any problem for a company that is hit by sudden conditions that it doesn't have time to notify. Those are exceptions in the bill. And it will not only more than pay for itself, but it was recommended by one of the President's own commissions, the Brock Commission.
Some Republican members of the House of Representatives have joined us on this program, sat in that chair and said this is an example of why we need a line item veto. If there was one, the President would simply veto plant closing provision, let the rest, most of it go, and everybody would be happy. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's a bad idea, and I think it's the reason why a line item veto is a bad idea. The line item veto has been presented by the administration as a way to save money. But the real reason that people want line item vetoes, that any president would probably like to have one, is it enables him to substitute his judgment for a majority of both houses of the Congress and to, with 1/3 of one house, dictate the policy of the government. Now, that's not been the tradition in our country since the foundation. The President has an enormous power in the general veto, but if he can go through a bill and just retailor it to his personal likes and dislikes, and do so really against the majority of the House and the Senate, we create a new constitutional arrangement that our founding fathers didn't think was a good idea. Let me make a political point. Lyndon Johnson asked for a line item veto when both houses were controlled by Democrats, and they rejected that notion. Secondly, Mickey Edwards, a member of the Congress from Oklahoma, an outstanding conservative, the former president of the American Conservative Union, opposed the line item veto because he thought that no president's power should be enhanced to such a degree, and as a conservative, he thought it was extremely unwise to give presidential power that much enhancement.
Birmingham, Alabama, good evening.
How are you?
Good.
First of all, let me compliment C-SPAN. I've been listening to you and watching you for, I guess, the past 2 years, and I'm just delighted that the American people have a forum whereby we can see what our friends like Representative Foley and our senators and congressmen really do in fact, rather than what we hear in the news media and what we see in the news print.
Thanks for watching.
My question very simply, I'd like to ask Mr. Foley, and I agree, he appears very friendly. He used a word a minute ago, fair. I'd like to play on the fair and honesty question directly to him, and it has to do a little bit with this question that was just asked. Let me ask the question first and then give you a little support and then listen to your answer, because I think I know what your answer is going to be. Are you telling me for sure that this trade bill is not being presented and the president blamed, as you blamed him early in this conversation, for trying to stop a game that the House of Representatives plays, such as the continuing resolution, where you and your colleagues know very well you're sandwiching stuff in there that you want to fly by the president, so you wait until it's too late for him to read it and act on it? Are you telling me that in this trade bill, none of that exists? That's my question.
Well, first of all, I wouldn't want to tell you that there's nothing in the trade bill that you might find possibly objectionable. There are many provisions of this bill. It's over 1,000 pages in size, but everyone knows what's in this bill and has had time to analyze it carefully. There is an objection, I think, a valid objection, to passing continuing resolutions with very great numbers of provisions at the very end of the year when the president does not have very much time to either decide to sign or not sign a resolution that's going to stop the government if it's not passed. And we made the decision in the Democratic leadership this year, the Speaker strongly supporting it, that we would move to pass the 13 individual appropriation bills and not go to a continuing resolution if we could possibly avoid it. Because I think some of the president's objections to continuing resolutions are valid. And I don't think any president should be put in the situation of having to make a judgment on a 12 or 1,300 page bill in 24 or 48 or 72 hours, and if he doesn't sign it, have the government stop. I think that's a valid objection. Now, long before the president came to the Congress in the State of the Union message and said he wasn't going to sign another 14-pound bill, and remember he's going to use his arm to indicate how heavy it was, somebody decided in our party, the leadership, that we would go ahead with the 13 appropriation bills as he wishes and has requested. We're going to do that. Despite the fact that when the president said he wasn't going to sign another 14-pound bill, some wag in the back of the chamber says, will you sign an 11-pound one? But we are sincere. We're moving forward to do the appropriation bills as soon as possible. That's a different problem, and it's a problem that's a valid complaint, and we're going to do our best to see to it that it's been taken care of. It wasn't designed to embarrass him. It wasn't designed to create this kind of conflict. The fact of the matter is that with the long new provisions of the budget process, we just got later and later doing the appropriation bills, and finally we're kind of forced into doing one major bill. But it has many disadvantages, as you point out.
Florida, go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Foley.
Yes, sir.
As I understand your position on the trade bill, you think it's a fine bill and it has a lot of things in there other than this 60-day
yes, sir.
plant closing thing. If it's such a fine bill otherwise, couldn't the Congress just take out the 60-day provision as you're asking the president to do? It seems like it works both ways here.
Well, it's a fine bill, not otherwise as far as I'm concerned, but a fine bill including the plant closing provisions. And we, in fact, voted on that in the House. We voted on whether to take it out. There was a motion offered to remove the plant closing provisions from the conference report. That was voted on, a roll call vote in the House, and a very substantial majority insisted on keeping the provision in. I think the provision's fair, proper, useful, valuable. I just disagree with the president on the question of whether it should be in the trade bill or not. The point I was making is that this is the only objection, this and one regarding Alaska oil export, that the President has publicly made. And we have already taken that issue up, as you've suggested. We have voted on whether to take the provision out, and we have decided not to do that by a vote in the Congress. Now, from the President's standpoint, we have come a long way in his direction. Time after time, provisions have been modified in the Congress, features have been taken out of the bill that he objected to. And we think everything is a matter of some compromise. There isn't any perfect bill, and that the value of this bill should indicate to the President that, notwithstanding some of his objections, this bill should be signed. We hope he'll do that. As a practical matter, he probably won't. He's pretty much on the record of saying he's going to veto it, but until the ink is dry on the veto, we have hope that he might reconsider.
Lakewood, Washington, go ahead, please.
Hello, Carl.
How are you today?
I saw you last winter out in Iowa, staggering around in the cold.
No surprise there.
One of Mr. Foley's, but we're from the same state. I'm
Yes,
on
sir.
the west side of the mountains. He knows what that means.
I'm an East Sider.
I wonder, Mr. Foley, if the American people don't have their concerns somewhat misdirected. Now, Ronald Reagan's good at one-liners and sizzling words like protectionist. But I've been watching the gentlelady from Maryland, Mrs. Bennett, and she's taken special orders out on 1 hour at a time, several times, explaining Japanese business practices in the United States. And just today on CNN's Moneyline, they were discussing the way Japanese buy stocks at the time they're about ready to pay a dividend on them, and then resell the stock immediately after the dividend's paid, and that there's some concern about that. And I'm from Washington. You know how we depend on Pacific Rim trade.
Yes,
I would be willing to give up something if we could get a better handle on Japanese business practices.
All right, Washington, thanks for the call.
Well, I think this bill is designed, and it will actually implement a policy of expanding trade. Its purpose is not to restrict trade. Its purpose is certainly not to limit our trading relationship with Japan, with Pacific Rim countries, or with the common market or other trading partners, Canada or countries in Central or South America. It doesn't have the purpose of stopping trade. It has the purpose of trying to expand our opportunities in the United States for reciprocal trading ability in the markets of other countries that they enjoy here. As you note, we come from a part of the country, the Northwest, where there is a great and important relationship with the Pacific, and our people earn as much from foreign trade as probably any people in any region of the country. But for the trade to be truly stable, it has to be based upon the reciprocal fairness and opportunity on both sides. Countries like Japan have grown very powerful and very rich economically from free trade and from open trade, but they, I think, are growing in their recognition now that the Japanese market has to be also available, that there are some restrictions that should be removed. That's true of other trading partners, and this bill is designed to provide that. But beyond that, it's also designed to provide an impetus to our more competitive ability to push exports, to develop good products, to meet the challenges of the international market, to continue negotiations, and so on, things that really there's no substantial disagreement between the administration and the Congress.
Lexington, Massachusetts, go ahead, please.
Yes, I just want to ask one thing. I mean, I heard what he said about Japan, and what I want to know is, are we going to continue? I have a Toyota. I love the car. How is he going to deal with the alienation factor in Detroit?
Deal with
the what factor in Detroit?
Alienation.
Well, I think workers in Detroit and other parts of the country expect to be faced with and to meet competition from foreign countries. I don't think many people really think that we should simply shut off all imports into the United States. But I also feel that what is fair for foreign car importers and exporters into the United States ought to be fair for American exports abroad. And when some countries maintain strict restrictions on American products, or there are quotas, or there are unfair non-tariff barriers, that's what causes the resentment. And I think we can meet competition in many, many areas of manufacture and agriculture if we have an opportunity to go in those markets on the same basis that foreign suppliers have to come into our markets. Now, there are people in the country, I suppose, who would just as soon we shut our borders to foreign goods. That isn't the majority position in Congress. That isn't the spirit of this bill. It's designed to expand, not to restrict trade.
Lubbock, Texas. Good evening. Go ahead, please.
Good evening. I'm wishing to speak about the 60-day plant closing. First of all, I want to thank C-SPAN for their coverage here. I finally found the truth instead of having everything being distorted and manipulated and biased. But on the 60-day closing, I'm aware of many plants that extend far greater time than just 60 days. There will be 6 months, a year. I heard Lee Iacocca from Chrysler say that they try to give a year and a half, even up to 2 years. And one of the fears that I have is that if this 60-day closing becomes law, then what is going to prevent all of these companies from saying, well, gee, why should we give them any more? This would really hamper their retraining and education possibilities if they were only required to have the 60-day closing. Representative Foley, could you respond to that, please?
Yes, I'd be glad to. I don't think any company that has been willing to give 6 months or 4 months or 3 months or a year and a half or whatever advance notice is going to fall back and say, well, now that the law requires 60 days, we're not going to give more than 60 days. That isn't really a probability at all. But the fact of the matter is that about 2 million workers a year lose their jobs from some kind of restructuring or plant closing or whatever. We've increased jobs, but we've also in the process lost a lot of jobs. And about 2 out of 3 of these workers do not get the kind of notice that this bill would require. Now, the bill itself, the provision of the bill, contains exceptions if there are special circumstances that unforeseen and so on that affect the company where it couldn't possibly know that it has to close the plant, or a loss of a contract or something of that character. For the rest, you know, it just seems that the original provisions of the bill, I think, called for 180 days notice, 6 months, and that was reduced consistently down to 60 days, which is moderate, it's fair, it's a notice not only to workers, but to communities as well. And we've heard testimony from mayors and city council people and so on, other public officials, that when they had notice that the plant was going to be closed, they could make decisions to help with the adjustment that were otherwise impossible for them to make. Some companies have given very full cooperation and notice, as you said, but there have been companies that have virtually ordered the entire workforce out the same day. In a matter of an hour and a half, or 2 hours, just ordered them to vacate the premises and given no notice at all. That's difficult to justify. And it also creates problems for the rest of us. Because if workers have noticed that their job is going to be terminated when the plant is closed, if communities have noticed, things can be done to retrain or to find other job opportunities that will save not only money in terms of the kind of unemployment compensation and other benefits that otherwise have to be paid, save money in terms of community costs, but give the workers the opportunity, the displaced workers, to find a new job and give them the ability and the satisfaction of new employment. And that is estimated to be worth something like $1.5 billion a year in terms of their wages.
Cupertino, California. Go ahead, please.
Congressman Foley,
Yes,
I take real exception to the fact that you say this bill has been read by every member of Congress. There have been several pieces in the San Jose Mercury News that indicate the Chicken Wars tax bill was not read when voted. In addition, I'd like to know how many more subsidies are in this bill, similar to what was given to the sugar industry, which will end up forcing the prices of sugar in this country up higher than it should be. Now, I haven't read the bill, but I have had somebody who's seen the bill who says there are 8 or 9 subsidies to American industry which are protectionist in the bill and don't get proper discussion and debate in this country, and it goes through with the 1,000 pages.
Well, I was answering a question by a gentleman who suggested what's the difference between this and a continuing resolution at the end of the year. The difference is that this bill has been available for scrutiny and examination for several weeks in its final form, or virtually its final form. And it's been 3 years in the making, so that provisions that are in the bill have been available for months and months. It's a little different situation if we get a bill out at the end of the year called a continuing resolution, which wraps together all the spending authority for the government, and the government's going to end 24 hours or 48 hours later in terms of its ability to function without that bill being signed. That's the distinction I was making. I wouldn't, of course, suggest to you that every member of Congress has sat down and meticulously examined 1,000 pages of this bill. But the administration and the people in the various departments of the administration and everybody who's had an interest in this bill has had an opportunity to do that. It's not being presented to them fresh from the committee with 24 or 48 or 72 hours notice. That's simply a different sort of problem.
Surf City, New Jersey, go ahead, please.
Hi, Congressman. How are you tonight?
Fine.
I'd like to change the subject briefly, and there's something I've been waiting to mention to you since February, and I'll be quick. On February the 3rd, the night the vote to the aid to the freedom fighters lost, I listened to Radio Moscow, and that's a communist broadcasting station that's on shortwave radio. And it was about 11:30 or 12 o'clock at night I listened to it. And the top story was that aid to the freedom fighters had lost. But I want you to know, I think you're a patriot, but what really surprised me was they quoted you on the station. I don't remember what they said, but they mentioned your name and gave a quote from you.
Well, I wouldn't know about that. I don't listen to Radio Moscow myself. You have me at a disadvantage there.
I'm not trying to put you at a disadvantage. The only point I'm trying to make is very simply, if I was in your position, and if I found that I was quoted on Radio Moscow, I would like to ask myself some questions, like why?
Well, I used to work for Senator Henry Jackson, who was, I think, one of the great patriots of this country. You might agree with that. He was quoted on Radio Moscow all the time. They didn't quote him very favorably, but just as it's your right to listen to Radio Moscow, and it would be, because you live in a free country, a terrible and false charge against you that you were somehow sympathetic to the Soviet Union because you were a listener to Radio Moscow. So I can't control and don't attempt to control what Radio Moscow says. I couldn't anyway. And the fact that they say something about me on the program is beyond my control. But if I were to just take positions in the Congress on what I think is right for our country, based upon what I thought Radio Moscow was going to think about it or say about it, I'd have a very tortured and crazy kind of standard to follow. I think you'd probably agree with that. We shouldn't let ourselves be manipulated one way or the other by the comments of Radio Moscow or the position of the Soviet Union. We have to individually do what we think is in the U.S. interests, and which advances U.S. security and U.S. progress, and then what Radio Moscow says about it is their business. It may be a matter of interest, but it shouldn't be a matter of great concern.
Just because you are a majority leader of the U.S. House of Representatives, something you say does carry a good deal more weight than most members of Congress. That sort of power, being able to talk about an issue and quote it and discuss because Representative Foley feels that way, become a problem, or is it difficult ever at all just simply having that sort of power?
No, I don't think it's all that great a power. It's what somebody called in the presidency the bully pulpit. Now we have enormous communication in this country and around the world, and frankly, almost without exception, members of Congress of both parties are subject to being quoted, and so if you don't want to say it, you shouldn't say it. If you don't want to write it, you shouldn't write it. And the only thing one can insist on is accuracy and fairness in how you're quoted. And there I'd like to pay a compliment to not only C-SPAN, but to the American press. I think political leaders around the world have, in no case that I know of, the kind of fairness and objective coverage that people in American public life have from the American press. There are always criticisms that people in politics make of press coverage, but in terms of the fairness, the objectivity, and the accuracy, it's unprecedented in the world. And of course, when you're talking yourself to the camera, You only have yourself to blame if you're misunderstood.
Burlington, Vermont, go ahead, please.
Yes, I just wanted to say that the plant closing issue is just a distraction for the other things that are in the bill, which are another attempt to take more power away from the presidency and designate it to Congress. There's a little provision snuck in there by Senate Finance Committee Chairman Lloyd Benson to limit the president's appointment powers. There's another one in there which limits presidential influence over International Trade Commission. There's another one involving procedural protectionism, which designates special interest trade priorities. And there's also another one in there that allows the Treasury Secretary to conduct international exchange rate talks, which he has no business doing. So what you wind up with is more power taken away from the presidency, and you have 535 Treasury Secretaries. And I think that that's just a monkey wrench in the works to use as a distraction when the real problem is what I just stated.
Well, it's interesting in response to that the president hasn't cited any of those things as objections to the bill. If the president was concerned and felt that those provisions were damaging to his authority, one would think that, and he thought they were worthy of a veto, one would think that he would have said that. Because in the opinion of some, the president has picked about the weakest possible basis. You say it's a subterfuge, the weakest possible basis on which to threaten to veto this bill. A provision that's fair, that's moderate, that is similar to but less rigid and stringent than most of the provisions our competitors have.
We now leave this program in order to bring you live coverage of today's conference of the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee. We now join the proceedings, already in progress.
And the 21st anniversary of the reunification of Jerusalem, to help deal with the intricate issues which impact the 40-year U.S.-Israel partnership. Thank you for coming to Washington. Your being here, involved in the deliberations which will shape the future agenda of the relationship, will truly make a difference. As you can imagine, putting together this policy conference was a massive undertaking. Everyone at AIPAC contributed significant time and effort to make this meeting a success. However, I must tell you that it takes a very special person with a tremendous amount of dedication, effort, and good humor to coordinate the myriad details which make all the pieces fall into place. Helene Godin was such a person. She's our policy conference coordinator. She's over there in the corner there. And Helene, to paraphrase your coworkers, you're fantastic. I don't want to give anybody any kinnahuras, but please join me in thanking Helene Godin for a terrific job well done. And now, without further ado, I'd like to call upon AIPAC's Chairman of the Board Emeritus, Larry Weinberg.
See, I didn't like emeritus. It sounds like an old man. An emeritus, I don't know, I have to think about that one. My friends, this afternoon, I have the privilege of introducing the first United States Secretary of Defense ever to address the annual AIPAC Policy Conference, the Honorable Frank Carlucci. Mr. Carlucci has one of the most impressive professional backgrounds of anyone in Washington. Career Foreign Service Officer, former U.S. Ambassador to Portugal, Associate Director and then Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Deputy Director and Undersecretary of the Department of Health, Education and Welfare, Deputy Director of the CIA, Deputy Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, and now Secretary of Defense. Practically the only position he hasn't held is President of the United States, but he's still a young man. During the Reagan years, the Secretary of Defense has played a critical role in U.S.-Israel relations. It's the Secretary of Defense who formally oversees and implements the strategic relationship between the United States and its most valuable, reliable ally in the Middle East, Israel. Israel has been named a major non-NATO ally. There are now biannual meetings between senior American and Israeli officials to plan for new strategic and tactical contingencies, as well as to work out ways to further military cooperation. Among the many steps taken in the strategic sphere, American and Israeli troops hold joint exercises, U.S. naval vessels regularly make port calls in Haifa, U.S. Air Force planes train in the Negev Desert, and the United States Navy and Marines train with squadrons of Kfir aircraft. We at AIPAC commend this administration and the Department of Defense for recognizing the value of Israel as a strategic asset and for having the courage and foresight to build, strengthen, and formalize this relationship. You have recognized that Israel is both a reliable friend and an effective ally. Since you have assumed the office of Secretary of Defense this past year, much has happened to further the U.S.-Israel relationship. You have signed a memorandum of understanding with Defense Minister Rabin, and just last month, the memorandum of agreement institutionalizing strategic cooperation was signed by President Reagan and Prime Minister Shamir. The strategic relationship is a reality. We are confident it will continue to grow with your leadership, guidance, and commitment. Mr. Secretary, we know that you face difficult days in the Pentagon, having to make tough decisions affecting our national security interests, and doing so in the era of Graham-Rudman-Hollings. We appreciate the immense pressure you are under to keep America strong and fulfilling our military commitments at home and abroad. In this room, you have allies in facing those pressures. We too want America to remain strong. We too want America to be the leader of the free world. As politically active and aware Americans, all of us, Democrats and Republicans alike, share your commitment to these essential goals. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a good friend of a strong U.S.-Israel strategic relationship, Secretary of Defense Frank Carlucci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weinberg, Chairman Aspin, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed an honor for me to speak at this very important forum, especially this year as the nation of Israel celebrates its 40th anniversary. Rarely do I have the opportunity to address a group that understands, as AIPAC so clearly does, the vital link in the life of nations between defense, strength, and security. Today I want to speak about several relationships of great strategic consequence. The relationship between the United States and Israel, the relationship between strength and security, and finally, the relationship between a nation's overall strength and its ability to safeguard each of its individual interests. I want to begin with the relationship between the United States and Israel, a relationship grounded in the ideals our two countries share. Israel has struggled, as few states have, to ensure its existence as a free nation, and has built a strong, self-governing society under the most difficult conditions. The United States can take great pride in standing by Israel in its first 40 years. Israel, for its part, has proved a faithful friend in a turbulent region. The United States has long sought to play a part in bringing peace to the Middle East, and we have every intention of continuing that effort. While our current approach is realistic and workable, we have no blueprint for peace that guarantees the end of conflict. But we do know that one element is indispensable. Any peaceful solution worthy of the name must provide for the security of all parties. The U.S. is committed to ensuring the security of Israel, a commitment that is underlined by the fact that Israel is the single largest recipient of American security assistance. In addition to $1.2 billion in economic support funds, the United States is delivering $1.8 billion in security assistance this year. All of it in the form of grants, not loans, has been the case. These funds help to finance every major weapon system in the Israeli Defense Force inventory. The F-15 Eagle is Israel's most powerful and agile fighter. The F-16, the bulwark of Israel's air defense. American-built radar surveillance aircraft provide support crucial to Israel's air operations. Israel's main battle tank, the Merkava, was built in large part by U.S. funds. More than 400 Merkavas are now in the field. Finally, the U.S. is considering ways to help Israel upgrade its Navy, now in effect a coastal patrol force, to counter the growing maritime power of Libya and Syria. The depth of our commitment to Israel's security should be apparent to anyone. But what should be equally clear is that American assistance is just one element in a relationship that is, in the decisive respect, one of strategic cooperation. For the past 5 years, American and Israeli officials have met together regularly to expand cooperative efforts on all fronts, economic, political, and military. These meetings have in important respects institutionalized what was already a close cooperative relationship. Last month, as Mr. Weinberg said, we formalized this relationship in a memorandum of agreement on joint political, security, and economic cooperation signed by President Reagan and Prime Minister Shamir on the occasion of Israel's 40th anniversary. Today, I want to mention several ways in which strategic cooperation contributes directly to our mutual security interests. The United States and Israel are now engaged in a number of defense-related joint research and development projects. Israel is one of 4 nations now working with the United States on a government-to-government basis on the Strategic Defense Initiative. That testifies to the advanced state of Israel's technological base and its ability to employ technological advances to strengthen its defenses. Experimental projects like the Arrow anti-tactical ballistic missile system hold great promise for Israel and will provide valuable contributions to our own research in strategic defense. They take on greater importance in a region where ballistic missiles and chemical weapons are beginning to proliferate. Those who consider themselves friends of Israel and who want to cut SDI funding should be asked how they plan to help meet Israel's security needs in a changing and more threatening military environment. In addition to cooperation on longer-term projects like the Arrow, Israel is proving to be an important source of weapons for the United States. Last year, 54% of the funds the United States spent to evaluate foreign weapons was spent on Israeli systems. Israeli defense sales to the United States have risen from just $9 million in 1983 to at least $250 million in 1987. As the United States continues to explore cost-effective ways to acquire the weapon systems it needs, there is little doubt that purchases from Israel will continue to grow. Even with severe fiscal pressures on U.S. defense spending, Israel will remain an important source of systems that are proven and ready, in some cases saving the United States the time and expense of developing its own. I want to turn now from relations between the United States and Israel to consider the broader relationship between strength and security. From Israel's point of view, the connection between strength and security is almost self-evident. We need look no further than the fact that Israel spends a full 40% of its gross national product on defense. In the United States, however, this crucial fact of international life is often overlooked. Especially today, the major factors in determining what America will spend on defense appear to be fiscal, not strategic. The result is enormous pressure to reduce defense spending without reference to the threat we face or to our international obligations. All of you know that in accord with congressional pressure at the budget summit last fall, the Department of Defense cut $33 billion from its 1989 proposed defense budget. That was only the beginning. I am now in the process of cutting more than $200 billion from the January 1987 estimate of funding requirements for the 5-year period from 1990 to 1994. There is simply no way that reductions of that magnitude can be made without profoundly affecting our defense posture in the decade ahead. I'm concerned that the American public has not yet taken note of what I believe is an ominous trend. 1989 will be the 4th straight year the defense budget declines in real terms. The rebuilding period of the early 1990s has ended. The question today is whether we are now entering into a new 1970s style decade of decline without even realizing it. The simple strategic fact of life is that there has been no corresponding reduction in America's global responsibilities, nor are any foreseen or even feasible. Indeed, it's quite possible that our responsibilities could increase in the years ahead. Nor has there been any decrease in the threat that we face. The Soviet Union and its satellites pursue aims and objectives at odds with ours and those of our allies, Israel included. We need to keep these strategic factors in mind as we make decisions that will affect our defense posture for years to come. Our challenge is to build a new defense consensus supporting the modest but steady real growth that our nation must have to defend its interests and that it can afford. In spite of current fiscal pressures, we must keep defense spending in perspective. Today, we spend 5.7% of our GNP on defense, just 0.5% more than we did when President Reagan set out to restore America's defense strength in 1981. The question is not whether we possess the economic means, but whether we will have the political will to maintain forces adequate to defend our interests. I want to conclude today with one last observation on strength and security. It is my view that our ability to defend American interests in any one part of the world is a function of our overall strength. A widespread perception that America's defenses are stretched too thin will not simply weaken us in one region or another. It will expose us to increased risk at every point. Security assistance is a case in point. Friends of Israel and the United States have long understood the critical role security assistance has played in direct support of Israel and in buttressing Camp David by assisting Egypt as well. Security assistance to other allies is equally important. Support, for example, for Portugal and Turkey affects the security of the entire Mediterranean region, not just NATO. My point is that whatever the issue, strategic partners must always think strategically. The close relationship between the United States and Israel will continue to be a source of strength to both nations, as it has been for the past 40 years. It must, because for both the United States and Israel, the stakes are high. Both our nations face formidable threats from states with interests and aims antithetical to our own. Predicting the course events will take is something neither individuals or nations can do with great confidence. In the words of Ben-Gurion, the great nation builder, all the experts are experts on what was. There are no experts on what will be. It may sound as if those words deliver a warning, advising us against searching the patterns of the past to predict the future. Perhaps. But I think they also remind us that our fate, what will be, is to a very great degree in our own hands. Israel's friends have seen it succeed against long odds because it possessed the will to do so. That is the way both our nations must face the future. Thank you very much.
It's quite clear that Ambassador Benjamin Netanyahu is a well-known figure to all of you. AIPAC is not an organization known to present plaques or symbols of appreciation except individual friendship. But we thought it was important today to recognize Bibi's contributions to the U.S.-Israel relationship. So, Bibi, on behalf of all of us, I have a plaque. And it reads, to Benjamin Netanyahu, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee recognizes your extraordinary contribution in conveying Israel's case to the American people while serving as Israel's ambassador to the United Nations and deputy chief of mission at Israel's embassy to the United States. You are a friend of America, a leader of Israel, and an eloquent and passionate defender of a strong relationship between the United States and Israel. May you go from strength to strength. Edward C. Levy Jr., President, and myself, Executive Director.
I wish you hadn't waited so long, because I would have taken it to the UN as a parting shot. Now, as you know, I'm leaving the UN, and I've been told by too many people that I respect that after 3 weeks in Israeli politics, I'll miss the UN. Now, that may or may not be true, but I can tell you what I will miss. I will miss very much the close working relationship that I've had from the day I came to Washington and spent here 2 years, and then continuously throughout my stay in the United States with the people in this audience and the people on this dais. I can't think of a more important mission for Israel's diplomacy than to secure the alliance with the United States. And the genius of AIPAC, and the genius first of Cy Kennedy, who founded AIPAC, was to understand, A, the importance of that relationship, the importance of alliances in general, the importance of this alliance in particular. Second, that in a democracy like the United States, the continuity of the relationship depends on public opinion and the distillation of public opinion, which is Congress. And I think that the work that is done here, has been done here by everyone here that I've had the occasion to work with, from Larry to Bob, now to Ed, to Tom Dine, who I think has worked indefatigably to expand that understanding and the power and the importance and the influence of AIPAC. I think it's a tremendous testimony that even the placards outside of these demonstrators, I think, attest to. I, myself, have labored 6 years to cement this relationship. But I think that if we look at it in retrospect, in the 40 years of Israel's existence, the change in the attitude of the United States to Israel, the important statements that you just heard from this podium would, I think, have been unthinkable 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. And this is a fantastic change for a people that had no state and had no politics and had no capacity to operate on the international scene less than half a century ago. I think today the relationship between the United States and Israel, with its bumps and its ups and downs, is probably as close and as unique as it is, I think, with few other countries, possibly with the exception of Britain or one or two else that I would say. It's a remarkable transformation. And it is certainly a tribute to AIPAC, I think a tribute to the maturation of Israeli diplomacy and political life. Now, in those 40 years, we've accomplished quite a bit, because the Jewish people perhaps compressed in this last half century the greatest catastrophes and the greatest triumphs of a long history that is full of such tremendous and momentous events. Yet I think that what has been accomplished, if you look at the achievements of Israel, they're legion. That is, a people that climbed from the last of 1,000 mass graves, that defeated assaulting armies, that liberated its homeland, created an independent state, liberated its ancient capital, revive an ancient language. All of these achievements, I think, are tremendous. Established a democracy. What a democracy, with a vengeance. But a democracy nonetheless, and I remember reading George Eliot's books in the 19th century, one of the great Christian Zionists, who said, there among the East, amid the despotisms of the East, will rise the great new hope. And it is the only hope for democracy in the Middle East today. Now, we can celebrate our achievements, but we can't lose sight of the challenges. We have many. I think the first one is to create, well, liberalize our economy. The economy can and will, I think, take off, but we have to allow people greater freedom of entrepreneurship, which Jews have found in so many lands and can find in Israel. I think we have to reform the way we elect our politicians. I say that even though I'm running. And I think too that we have an enormous task in changing the balance by which today only 1/4 of the world's Jews live in Israel and 3/4 live outside. That is certainly a central task of Jewish life, not only Israel's life. But having posed all these challenges, there is clearly one overriding all of them, and that is the quest for peace, the quest, of course, for security. That we have not achieved. We've achieved it only in parts. We've cracked that wall of hostility with Egypt, but the totality, the majority of the Arab world still remains opposed not to Israel's size or its borders or its policies or its character, but to Israel's existence. And this remains the fundamental obstacle to achieving a broader peace between us and the Arabs. I think that that is not presented as such today. You don't hear that this is the obstacle. You hear many other things. What you've seen, I think, are two processes in public opinion which have to be vigorously resisted. The first one is the attempt to encapsulate, to compress the Arab-Israeli conflict into the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. This, by the way, is done over weeks and months, during which most of the Arab press, including mainstream press in places like Kuwait, presents not Israel, but the Jews as pigs, as murderers, as dogs, as people who bake Arab children's blood in matzot. This is not anti-Israeli stuff. And that is repeated across most of the Arab world with scant knowledge, I would say with no knowledge, on the part of audiences that receive the so-called truths about the Middle East from the mass media. The second phenomenon is the reversal of causality. The reversal of causality, which says it's all the problem of Israel's control of the territories. This is the genesis, the start all, the end all of the conflict. And of course, that is hammered away again and again and again, and by dint of common repetition, endless repetition, it assumes the cachet of self-evident truth. It is a reversal of causality. The control of those territories I would say, was not the cause of the war, but a result of the war. And the ability of Arab propaganda to change causes effect is not unique for the last 20 years of Israel's history. Because after all, we didn't have a single soldier in any of these territories when they launched the Six-Day War against us. It started in the first 20 years. In the first 20 years, many of you remember, some of you are too young to do so. In the first 20 years, the cause of the Arab-Israeli conflict was the Palestinian Arab refugees. And of course, there wasn't a single refugee in 1948 when the Arabs launched a war against us, caused the refugees. So what the Arabs do constantly is take the consequences of their aggression and present it as their cause. Now, some of you may think, well, maybe so. Maybe it's not territory per se. Maybe it's not refugees. It's the fact that the Palestinian Arabs don't have a state of their own. Well, they were offered a state of their own. In 1948, they summarily rejected, out of hand. They didn't want anything to do with it. And you tell me, well, that was 40 years ago. 40 years have passed. It's changed. Has it changed? I don't know if any of you have read the New York Times yesterday or 2 days ago. There was one other of so many statements by the leaders of the riots, by followers of the riots. One addressing himself, in this case, to the Prime Minister of Israel. It's a free country. He said, there won't be peace. We want Haifa, Jaffa, Ramlet. And you hear this on CBS interviews, you hear this on world press interviews, you hear it on Israeli television today. They say, we don't want the West Bank, we don't want Gaza, we want Israel. And this is said by champions or favorites of some in the American press. It jolted a lot, or some in Israel, when Muhammad Darwish, who's commonly known as the cultural minister of the PLO, the perfect partner for peace in the eyes of some, said, all of you should disappear, even your dead. Take your dead with you. Disinter the bones of the dead. And most recently, it appeared from none other than the current darling of some on the American scene, Mubarak Awad. I'd like to read you a quote of Mubarak Awad. This is from March 22nd, 1988. It's not a long time ago. There are military operations that are being carried out to liberate Palestine. I agree with all of them. I agree with everything the PLO decides. The PLO wants all of Palestine, and I agree. Palestine for me is the Galilee, Akko, Ashdod, everything. I demand all of Palestine, every inch of it. Now there are two important things in Mubarak Awad's statement. One is that he's for violence, and in fact, he is not advocating nonviolence as a substitute for violence. He's advocating as a complement to violence. And the second thing that is important is that the goal has not changed. It may have put on a mask, it may have deluded some, it may still delude some. It has not changed. And the question has never been, it is not now, that the Palestinian Arabs lack a state, but that the Jews have one. Now, if we want to change that reality, if we want to expand the peace, if we want to change the attitude, then we have to ask, how do you bring about a change in thinking of those in the Arab world who believe that they can accomplish this goal? I think that to get the Arab world to recognize the right of Israel to exist, you have to first get them to accept the indelible fact of Israel's existence. You have to change their conception that Israel will somehow disappear, because as long as they believe that, it'll be very hard to convince them to make peace. And once they do, it becomes much easier than people think. Sadat said in his biography that what urged him, what made him realize that the political path, that peace was inevitable, was the failure of the attack on the Yom Kippur War. They had us, again I must speak like a diplomat, by the throat. And within 3 weeks, we were at the gates of Cairo. That's when he realized it's not going to work. And the question now is, how do you get the Arab world to recognize the permanence of Israel? How to etch it in their minds? Now, just as some people mistake the inherent cause, the inherent problem, and make no mistake about it, make no mistake about it, these territories pose considerable problems, problems of security, problems of coexistence, problems of the status of the inhabitants, all sorts of problems. But whatever they are not the problem. The problem is what Mubarak Awad says is the problem. So how do you get them to change? Just as many people today do not understand the underlying problem, they're confused and are being deliberately confused about a potential solution. And what they're told is, get out. Get out of those territories. Just walk away. Who needs it? Who needs those territories? Well, let me try to say why that would be a tragic mistake. Two things have changed since the Six-Day War. The first thing that has changed is the threat within the territories, the potential threat from these territories. And the second thing that has changed is the threat from outside the territories. I want to start with the first. I want to ask you a question. How many of you have flown to Israel recently? Not enough. We need much more. I mean that. We do need much more. We need to fill the planes and fill the hotels. The plane that you flew in will not be able to land if we relinquish control of those hills controlling the airfields and the mountains on top of them. Because today there are weapons like the Stinger missile that simply shoot that plane down. You don't even have to get to the fences of the airport. And if you don't control a territory, you don't control what's coming in there. And you cannot demilitarize against tiny weapons. Today you have 1,000 or 10,000 people throwing rocks. Tomorrow you'll have 10,000 young men throwing rockets. And the proliferation of new technology makes the possession of this territory, which sits astride Israel's cities, its towns, its villages, 80% of its population, it makes it doubly threatening. This weapon, the Stinger missile, rolled back the Soviet army in Afghanistan. These illiterate fighters with muskets were handed Stingers, and it changed the course of the war against the mightiest empire in the world. Now I can tell you that's not the only thing that can come in there. There are things, I can say this, it's on the New York Times, I read it a few weeks ago. Must be true. There are things called target designators. You see, there are other missiles, more lethal, that are placed at a longer distance. For example, there are missiles today in Saudi Arabia. Now, they're the kind of missiles that the Chinese have given to the warring parties in the Iran-Iraq war, and you see, they're not very effective. That is, they don't hit very precisely. But according to the New York Times, if you sit on the hills overlooking any one of the targets in Israel, you can point a laser device, it's not very big, it's about this big, you can point it to the target. And the missiles, as they're coming in, are equipped with optical devices, and they can home in, zero in with deadly accuracy. And that means that the threat within the territories, if we vacate them, could pose, I think, a tremendous challenge, not only to our airfields, all our military airfields. We don't have that many, and I have to observe military censorship. But I won't need many fingers to number them. And all our induction and mobilization centers, which we depend on to recruit 3/4 of our army in times of 48 hours in times of war, all of that would be mobilized. The threat has changed. And those who say that in the missile age territory does not count are wrong. It counts a lot more, and will count more and more in the future. And the first missile war, the first missile age was introduced in the Yom Kippur War. Had the Arab armies advanced what they advanced during that missile war in 1967, Israel would be in the sea. The threat without the territories, from without the territories, has also changed. And I'll be very brief because I see these notes being passed. The threat has changed. Take my time. The threat has changed for a very simple reason. The Arab armies have grown threefold since 1967. I don't know if you can appreciate it, but you can because you track this threefold. Now I'll tell you something. The Israeli army has also grown, they say, some people say by 3. Now if you had one rifle and they had 10, now they have 30 and you have 3. The gap is now not 9 rifles, it's 27 rifles. And that poses formidable problems for us. In some cases, they've grown more than by 3. The Iraqi army had 7 divisions 10 years ago. It has 45 divisions today. Now, somebody took a hammer a decade ago and smashed the Arab world into smithereens. And that hammer is called the Iran-Iraq War. And it made impossible the formation of an Eastern Front against Israel. And consequently also, I think, even the potential of a Western Front against us. That war is going to come to an end. I assure you it's going to come to an end. Because it's not a question, I know some of you think if Khomeini would die, but contrary to all rumors, he is not immortal. And there are other reasons why that war will eventually grind to a halt. And when it does, the possibility that a massive alliance will take place and will be posed in front of Israel's back door, an alliance that could muster 1,100 tanks, that's more operational tanks than now exist in NATO. How will we defend ourselves against this? If we do not control the Jordan River, if we do not control the 5 passes that lead up to the mountain range, if we do not control the electronic and radar platforms, if we do not control the ridgeline and the approaches from the ridgeline to our towns, our villages, and our cities, In other words, if we do not have full military control of this territory, how will Israel prevent itself from being overrun from a potential threat from the east? So I think that those who counsel us to simply get out of that territory without any understanding of the different world that we live in are making the tragic and the common mistake of all inept military planners. That is, you are told never to plan for the last war, and here we're compounding the mistake. We are told to plan for the war before the last war. Well, that won't happen. It won't happen. I think we are united in Israel on this. And it's important to explain that because I think that many of our critics, and certainly the Arabs, do not understand our democracy. They do not understand on what we unite. For example, we also know that if we were to hand over this territory today, it's very likely that the PLO will take hold of it because a boundary is not merely a military line, it's a political line as well. And what has happened in the last 20 years is that the relative power of the PLO, that is relative to Hussein, has radically changed. The PLO hardly existed 20 years ago. But today Hussein cannot make a move, even on procedural matters, in political negotiations without the PLO. And if this territory is handed to the PLO, either directly or indirectly, then it will pose a life-threatening danger to the future and the survival of the state of Israel. The question then is, what kind of solution can we expect under these conditions? I think in the next decade, when you have this race between radicals and non-radicals in the Middle East, when so much of it is potentially directed against our borders, we need a solution in terms of this problem, in terms of the problem of these territories and the Palestinian Arabs. We must have a solution that gives Israel maximum security and for the Arabs minimum interference in their daily lives. I think it's important to allow a period in which we create a modus vivendi of living together. And that means first putting these riots to a halt. They must be brought to a halt. And we can bring them to a halt. And we will bring them to a halt. But secondly, also establishing the kind of environment envisioned in Camp David to allow passions to cool, to allow a testing and a building of trust, and to allow the formation and the emergence of a different, a more moderate Palestinian Arab leadership with which we can negotiate. I think under the present conditions, to hand over territory to these people convinced that we are a roll of a dice away from the Mediterranean, I think that would be the height of folly. There is agreement, as I've said, and there is disagreement. We disagree on the precise final disposition of these territories of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. But we all agree, at least the mainstream in Israel agrees, that we will not have a third state between Jordan, I should say between the desert and the sea. And for good reason. Such a state, such a unilateral withdrawal on the part of Israel would not be a formula for peace. It will be a formula for disaster. Now, I think that the truths that I hasten to say, the truths that I've just described, I'm not ashamed to use those words. Because I think that anybody who has a real historic and factual scrutiny of the reality on the ground today will recognize them for being just that, truths. I think those truths are being obfuscated, are being deliberately distorted, and are being substituted with lies. And I think that includes, I'm afraid, not only segments of public opinion in America, but also important segments of America's leadership. I think, and potentially maybe also its future leadership. If a truth is substituted by a lie, and if the lie is allowed to spread unchallenged, it becomes truth. And I think the one big challenge that we face today is to convince, in the United States, is to convince the future leaders of America that the policy that calls for unilateral Israeli withdrawal, that the notions that claim that the crisis and the conflict will be resolved by giving the Palestinian Arabs, in this case what they mean is the PLO, a state of their own, bordering Israel, I think we must convince them, and convince them soon, that this would be a recipe for disaster. And I think there's no one else to do it but the people in this room and the people that they're associated with. I've grown immensely proud of AIPAC and its capacity to operate not only on Capitol Hill. It has the capacity to reach out. It has the capacity to work with other Jewish organizations to impress on the minds and on the hearts of America what we've been talking about. I think a great deal has been accomplished already because we have the room to maneuver. We didn't have it years ago, but we have it now. And I think we're on the verge of a difficult but surpassable challenge. The question is, of course, will we live up to that challenge? Well, based on what we've accomplished up to date, I would say yes, a resounding yes. And I say that because of all the changes that have taken place over the last 40 years, those that I began my talk on, I think the one I'll close on, the most important change that has taken place, is the change in the Jewish people's approach to their destiny. We had lost control of our destiny, and the rebirth and reemergence of Israel returned that control to us. It returned it for those of us who live in Israel, who have fought for Israel, militarily, politically, and in other ways, who have built Israel. It changed the character of Jews inside Israel, but I must say I think it also changed the character of Jews outside Israel. The fact that you have here a hall inside Washington, D.C., the most important capital in the world, the fact that this hall is attended by a sea of faces of activists, Jewish activists, who challenge the currents of fate, who challenge the automaticity of history. Because when it comes to Jewish history, the only thing that is automatic, if you do nothing, is calamity. And the fact that you have this desire here, not only in Israel, to take charge of the future, to mold it to such a way that we will never relive the past, I think is a tremendous testimony to the greatest change that has taken place. The rediscovery of the Jews to defend themselves, and by so doing, to quicken their pride and their sense of worth. Thank you very much.
Scheduled over here, Gene.
You play tennis already?
Congressman Les Aspin of Wisconsin, chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, has emerged as the key leader in the Congress of the United States in developing and expanding strategic cooperation between the United States and Israel. He has led in new and innovative ways to enhance the alliance between the two countries. Congressman Aspin has a long and strong record of support for the U.S.-Israel relationship. He has been a consistent advocate of economic and military aid for the Jewish state, and he has consistently opposed efforts to supply high-technology, lethal weapons to countries at war with Israel. Les Aspin is a major force in the area of defense cooperation. As he said last year, U.S.-Israel relations must be based on strategic cooperation, and I quote, because a united stand is vital to peace in the Middle East. He also emphasized that a strong relationship between the United States and Israel is for the good of the defense of the West as a whole. Let me share with you an example of Congressman Aspin's support. The Conference Committee for the fiscal year 1988 Defense Authorization Bill prepared to meet. Congressman Aspin met with Tom Dine and Tom's aide, and as well as the Congressman's key staffers. They examined every issue on the pro-Israel agenda. Throughout the meeting, Congressman Aspin focused on those policy items that would promote cooperation between the two countries and strengthen the armed forces of the United States as well as the IDF. He worked to ensure that the package proposed would be the package adopted. When the continuing resolution was in conference, Les Aspin sent a message to that conference, stressing the items he felt were vital and must be funded. Of the 9 items he stressed, 4 were of critical importance to enhance strategic cooperation between the U.S. and Israel. The Arrow anti-tactical ballistic missile that Secretary Carlucci mentioned, the Israeli-developed Popeye air-to-ground missile, a night targeting system for target acquisition by helicopters, and cooperative research and development for major non-NATO allies, a category that, of course, now includes Israel. It is our view that the relationship between the United States and Israel will be the strongest when Israel is able to abandon foreign aid in favor of foreign trade. Les Aspin is the leader in Congress in moving to make this goal a reality. Speaking personally, as one who served over 5 years in the U.S. Army and 7 years as aide to the Secretary of the Army, I have long been an admirer of Les Aspin. He was one of the famous whiz kids of Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and served with distinction in key civilian positions in the Pentagon. We should all derive great comfort in knowing that we have a chairman of the House Armed Services Committee who brings to his present crucial post high intelligence, great expertise, and a dedication to adequate but cost-effective national defense for our country. He is the leading strategic thinker in the House of Representatives. I give you one of the pro-Israel community's best friends in Congress, the Honorable Les Aspin of Wisconsin.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Thank you all very much. If those of you who are trying to follow the proceedings today by watching your program, you will be a little confused. As you notice, the program has changed around a little bit. And in fact, let me tell you, I've been watching the notes go back and forth. It's changed more often than you know. Sometimes it's changed, and before a little long it gets changed back again. So, but not to worry. I've never been to one of these things that went off on time and on schedule yet, so why start now? Let me also say that it's always a pleasure to be here and to follow the rest of the program, because just sitting here and listening to the speakers, you always learn something. But let me talk a little bit today and take a few minutes of your time, and then maybe we'll get to the opening of the plenary session. Let me just take a few minutes of your time to talk about one aspect that has come up in the two previous speakers, and that is the strategic relationship between the United States and the State of Israel. And I'm speaking now as a person who has followed the United States defense issues for some time and watched and worry about our strategic policy and worry about the defense policy of the United States. And as chairman of the Armed Services Committee, that's part of what we should do, and indeed Congress ought to do more of that. I've always thought, get more involved in the issue of what is our policy, as opposed to how many of what weapons are we buying, but really what is the policy, and what is our strategic relationships, and what are our alliances, and what is it all about? And as somebody who has watched this whole process, I am amazed at the continuity of the development of the strategic relationship between the United States and the State of Israel, as it has occurred pretty relentlessly and consistently through all administrations, Democratic as well as Republican. I mean, we see headlines where the relationship between Israel and the United States is going very well, and then we see other times in the headlines where there's clashes and differences of opinion. But beneath all of that kind of on-again, off-again stuff that's in the press, the strategic relationship, the alliance relationship between the United States as a military force and the State of Israel and its military forces has been a remarkable, steady kind of growth. And just to go into a little bit of the history of the thing, for example, the first period, which I would say covers roughly from the birth of the State of Israel in '48 through the Kennedy years, was characterized in the United States, I think, as a time of deep sympathy for Israel, and indeed a sort of sense of moral responsibility. There was public support for Israel, an outpouring of emotion, affection, sympathy, and vocal support for a little country facing an enormous Arab enemy. But official Washington, of course, was very interested in even-handedness. Official Washington did not want to offend the Arabs and insisted on keeping considerable distance between the United States and Israel. Arms sales, no way. The principal arms supplier for Israel in those days was the French. And the Navy made no port visits. Israeli leaders made no state visits to the United States. There was, however, even in those days, a strategic relationship which has been kept mostly under wraps but was pretty extensive, which was that the two intelligence services, the intelligence services of the two countries, found they had an enormous common community of interest. But it's really from the beginning that relationship existed, but that existed out of sight. What was visible and what was in sight was pretty much of a relationship that I would say was pretty much a relationship of the heart. A sympathy, moral responsibility, but not what you would call a relationship of the head. And what has gradually evolved from those days is that a relationship of the head has developed, so that it's not just something that the United States would like to do, but something that it has become gradually in the United States' interest to do, which was to further this strategic relationship. Under the Johnson administration, there was a couple of steps forward. One was that after the 1967 war, de Gaulle halted arms deliveries and the United States moved into the gap. So after the 1967 war, major arms deliveries began coming from the United States. That was one important relationship. And also, I would say that that in that time, the president did, I think, meet with Prime Minister Eshkol. Prior to that, no American president had ever met with a prime minister of Israel. So by the beginning of 1970s, it was a pretty kind of sketchy relationship. It was a relationship of intelligence, and it was a relationship on arms sales, and there wasn't very much more. In the Nixon-Ford period, or I should rather say, I guess, during the Kissinger period, there were a couple of notable developments. First, Washington demonstrated a real interest in the peace process, and second, Kissingerian realpolitik is the governing mode of operations. What it meant for the strategic relationships was that meetings between the United States government and Israeli officials and meetings between presidents and prime ministers became a matter of routine. And it began in those periods, and even then, it was the beginning of that kind of a period. It shows you how much has changed in such a short amount of time when you realize that how recently it's been that you have these kinds of meetings. The Carter administration shifted from realpolitik to idealism. He never liked the use of arms sales as a lever against Israel, and in fact never did use arms sales. The thing that happened under the Carter administration was the first evidence of port calls. The first actual port call occurred under the Carter administration when the Nimitz arrived in Haifa in 1978, and afterwards the Eisenhower called. Connected with the process, the peace process, and the Nimitz. Actually, the Nimitz was beforehand, was in fact an effort by the Carter administration to quiet a lot of criticism that they were having. He was having a big fight with Menachem Begin, and in order to quiet it, the first port visit occurred under that kind of a circumstances. But the second port visit occurred after the Camp David Accords were signed, and that was the breakthrough there. So what you really had was, as of the 1980s opened, this gradual progression from the intelligence, which was the only relationship under Eisenhower, Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy, to arms sales under LBJ, to regular visits with head of the Israeli government under Nixon and Ford, to the beginning of port calls under Jimmy Carter. Then comes Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan had his own ideas. He said, and I quote, "The paramount American interest in the Middle East is to prevent the region from falling under the domination of the Soviet Union," end quote. Now, Israelis clearly would have preferred to hear a statement about the centrality of Israel. The Kissingers and the Carters of the world would have told Reagan that he was making a 1950s observation in the 1980s, but never mind. The result of Reagan's analysis was clearly to strengthen the U.S.-Israeli relationship. One can fault him, as I often do, for doing the right thing for the wrong reason, but essentially he was out to shaft Moscow rather than help Israel, but no matter. Never mind the motivation, the product was really a very dramatic one. Now, the State Department, of course, wasn't all that overjoyed. They had held that we had a commitment to Israel's survival, and that was all that mattered for Israel. So why complicate relations with the Arabs by adding port visits and joint military exercises and the like? They also argued that talk of strategic relationship was meaningless because Israel was too small to do anything for us in return. There were four key developments that overturned the naysayers and brought about changes in the 1980s. One of these was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan did want closer ties and did not want to read memos that advised otherwise. Secondly, the Iranian Revolution and the Carter Doctrine expanded the American role in the region and necessitated closer ties to the one stable, reliable, militarily capable nation in the region. Third, the matter of terrorism. The terrorist threat was growing, and Israel was one of the few countries with any idea of how to cope with it. And fourth, closer ties of between both countries were a natural byproduct of Camp David. So what have we seen in the 1980s? A number of them were mentioned by Frank Carlucci here a little while ago. An awful lot. We've signed 3 formal agreements with Israel. The President has issued a National Security Decision Directive that establishes a joint political military group. Port visits have developed apace. We now have joint military exercises. We have authorized the pre-positioning of U.S. military equipment in Israel for use in an emergency. Israeli hospitals are prepared to accept American casualties, and all the details pinpointing helicopter landing pads and the specific skills of individual hospitals have been worked out. Israel has declared a major non-NATO ally. Purchases of Israeli-made equipment by the U.S. military have grown about 20-fold. A lot has happened to cement the relationship, to build a relationship of the head as well as the heart. The question, of course, is where does it all go from here? Israel has, over the years, become more and more of an ally, but as yet, there is no formal alliance. It is interesting at this point, I think, to compare our Israeli relationship with those countries that we do maintain a formal alliance. For example, NATO. Our relationship with our formal allies is lately quite strained. For example, trade. This is a decade of trade in which we have clashes of deep political and economic significance with most of our friends and allies, including Canada, Japan, and Germany. But no one complains of harsh or restrictive Israeli trade policies for the simple reason that they don't exist. Israel, of course, is a small economy, but other small countries are causing us economic problems. Israel is not. Second, burden sharing. We devote over 6% of our GNP to defense. Our allies in NATO devote only half of that proportion to defense, Japan less, while accepting our troops and our planes and our ships that provide for much of their defenses. It is an inequitable division of the burden of allied defense, and is an issue that irritates the American public, often really inflaming public opinion. Israel does not seek our troops and spends about 25% of its GNP on its defense. We have no friction over burden sharing with Israel. Third, lack of support. By this I mean the unwillingness of many of our friends and allies to support American initiatives around the world, especially in the third world. This is an interesting issue with regard to Israel. Israel cannot be criticized for giving inadequate support to American policies. It might, in fact, be faulted for giving too much support to some questionable American policies. The Iran-Contra is an example. But basically, you have trade, burden sharing, and the lack of support are three things that are all putting strains on our relationship with our kind of traditional and formal allies. None of this is a problem with Israel. However, while we don't have those common frictions with Israel, we do have some conflicting interests, and it would be a mistake not to recognize these. Those stem from one fact. Israel is a regional power with a dominant security concern in the region, while we are a global power with global interests. These differences ought not and really cannot be papered over. The Middle East is Israel's backyard. This is where its survival is at stake. As an oil importer, the United States has some obvious interests in the Middle East. More importantly, as a global power, the United States has interests in being able to deal as even-handedly as possible with a number of governments. And it is at the heart, but this is the thing that is at the heart of the debate over the U.S.-Israeli relationships. The critics allege that we have made commitments to Israel that conflict with our national interests and that hobble our relationships with our Arabs. It would take mental contortions of immense proportions to deny that our relationship with Israel complicates our relations with the Arab states and makes it harder to achieve some important goals that the United States would like. But really, let's not exaggerate this. For 3 decades, the naysayers in the Washington bureaucracy said, we can't let our warships call at Israeli ports. The Arabs will go into orbit. We can't hold military exercises with the Israelis. The Arabs will have a fit. We won't gain much from the port visits and the exercises while we stand to lose a lot. But now what happens? We schedule regular port visits, we hold military exercises, and the Arabs who liked us before still like us, and the Arabs who hated us before still hate us. The reason is simple. Most Arabs thought the United States had cemented close military ties with Israel in 1948. The port visits and joint exercises didn't sound like anything new to an Arab who thought the American and Israeli militaries were already virtually one and the same. So I think that every objective observer looking at that history over the past few years of those kind of clashes over these symbolic activities, any objective observer would now have to admit that we have learned an important lesson from those years. We were simply too cautious and imagined Arab sensitivities that didn't exist. If we're going to have a workable policy in the Arab world, we must do better than that in understanding the Arab world. So let me summarize our relationships with Europe as compared to our relationships with Israel. This is what it looks like. Focusing on Europe, we do not have serious problems within the region because we have shared interests within the region. We are united in Europe on holding back the Soviet Union. To be sure, there are differences in nuance and degree to which we see the Soviet threat, but essentially there is no difference of interest within the region. But in the greater world, we and our NATO allies are not united. The Europeans have other interests around the world, interests that often conflict with ours in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. Focusing on Israel, the picture is reversed. The positives are negatives, and the negatives become positives. We have interests in the region that sometimes conflict with Israel's, but in the larger world, there is rarely a conflict. Israel sees its larger interests served if American interests elsewhere in the world are not undermined and American capabilities not drained away. So where do we go from here? Clearly, I do not see much of a threat to this relationship, the underlying long-term relationship. I do see glitches galore. The West Bank settlements, arms sales to the Persian Gulf states, Golan Heights, but these are glitches. They cause pain and give one or the other or both of us some stomach distress. But they don't alter the basic framework of enduring interests. Some say that the next step in our relationship is a full-fledged formal alliance. Most recognize that that won't materialize before there is a comprehensive settlement. I think a little caution needs to be followed here. Alliance could make Israel more like a traditional ally. If we had a defense treaty with all of its accoutrements, would our relationship with Israel be bedeviled by hassles over burden sharing? Would Israel no longer feel any need to support U.S. interests in the far-flung corners of the world? Or on Israel's side, given the Taiwan experience, would Israel suffer doubts about a guarantee that it doesn't now want or need to rely on? It's an interesting possibility worth thinking about. It could alter even the direction in which the heart and head have pointed for 4 decades. Nevertheless, the fact is, a genuine peace supported by real security guarantees remains the premier goal of Israel and the United States. It is only important to recognize an alliance is not the answer to and will not end all of the problems. So where do we go from here? I see both quantitative and qualitative improvements ahead. First, some quantitative changes. I see more port visits, more prepositioning of American military equipment in Israel, more foreign aid freed for Israel to spend as it feels best, more integrated military planning, and more sales of Israeli-made weapons to the United States Armed Forces. The last point represents a real challenge. Israel is selling superbly designed equipment to the United States right now, but more could be sold. I see, however, the heavy hand of the Pentagon bureaucracy interfering. There is a term in the Pentagon, NIH, meaning not invented here. The bureaucracy resists buying Israeli weapons because they are NIH. We have to cut that Gordian knot. Then you will see a real surge, a real quantitative increase in Israeli sales to the U.S. military. I can also see some qualitative improvements in the relationship. There is one in particular that I think is important. As mentioned earlier, for 5 years we have had a joint political military planning group. Its purpose is to discuss and flesh out the U.S.-Israeli strategic relationship. Its existence is, in fact, a concrete expression of those close ties. But we can do better. 2 years ago, I pressed legislation under which Israel has officially been designated a major non-NATO ally. That is also a concrete expression of our close ties. But we can do more. We should upgrade these formal links. Let's not just meet on the level of the joint political military group. Let's reach higher. The Minister of Defense in Israel and the Secretary of Defense of the United States should meet formally and officially at least once every 2 years, preferably every year, to coordinate and consolidate the ties. The U.S. has a long commitment to the heart to serve as the defense of last resort to Israel's existence. Such regular contacts by the heads of each nation's military establishment would telegraph the commitment to friend and foe alike. This would be a significant qualitative improvement in the U.S.-Israel strategic relationship. In conclusion, Israel holds a unique position in the firmament of our foreign relations. In some ways, that uniqueness is awesome, to adopt the word of the decade. In other ways, that uniqueness generates unique problems that require unique management to devise unique solutions. But that isn't all bad, especially from Israel's standpoint compared to other allies. The uniqueness requires us to devote particular attention to Israel. At least Israel never has to worry, as do scores of Latin American and African countries, that we will just lump her together with all the other countries in the region. There is a final point to be made. There are people in this country worried about a closer U.S.-Israeli alliance because of issues such as what is occurring now on the West Bank. But differences such as those exist in any alliance. After all, look what's happening to our other allies, what's happening with our other allies in NATO. One of our allies in Europe told us we couldn't overfly its territory to reach Libya. Another ally, whose capital city residents are unhappy at the noise made by the F-16s, is making us close our base there. Still others do not wish to cooperate with us in the Persian Gulf, even while we help assure their fuel supplies. And others are saying our ships can't visit unless we say they carry no nuclear weapons. Those are all vexing problems that cause a great deal of perspiration to flow in the corridors of the State Department and the Pentagon. Yet no one I know in the U.S. government is suggesting we bury the NATO alliance. To be sure, we have some workday frictions with Israel, but we shouldn't hold the Israeli-American alliance to a higher standard than other alliances. Thank you very much.
Chairman Aspin, the level of applause only indicates our appreciation for your wisdom and your service to our country.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I have before me a schedule. It says 2 o'clock, Gary Wallen opens. 2:03, Asher introduces officers and Ed Levy. 2:06, Ed Levy speaks.